you for joining us for another webinar. In today's webinar, we are going to be discussing TN visas for Canadians, and this is specific to Canadians, how to qualify, how to apply, and just a general overview and discussion of TN visas and the process. Before we get started, we'll do some introductions. Also, if you do have questions, we love questions. So if you could drop those in the chat. If we have time at the end, we'd love to address your questions that you have. If we're not addressing those in the presentation itself, feel free to submit your questions. Again, we love those questions and would like to answer those for you. My name is Jeremy Richards. I'm one of the partners with Richards and Jurusik Immigration, and we solely practice U.S. immigration, with a large focus of our practice dealing with Canadian citizens who want to live and work in the United States. So we have decades of experience helping Canadians to live and work in the US, and TN visas is something we deal with on a daily basis. So we're very familiar with the TN visa process and how that applies to Canadians specifically. And I'm here along with my business partner, Christine Jurusik, and I'll let her introduce herself.
Hi, my name is Christine. I am a partner at Richards and Jurusik, and we work with a lot of TNs. So welcome.
So let's get into it. We're going to cover the TN in general. What is the TN? What is that classification? What does that mean? Who is eligible to obtain TN status? What are the TN occupations or professions that are approved for TN status in the United States? The application process and what that looks like. The difference between pre-clearance at an airport such as Toronto or a land port such as the Peace Bridge or Fort Erie. Common mistakes to avoid in the TN application process, and just give you a rundown of some of our upcoming webinars if you have any interest in that as well. So what is the TN visa? Well, TN comes from trade NAFTA, and trade NAFTA then turned into the NAFTA agreement, which now is the USMCA. So that's where TN comes from. And it's a visa status that's specifically available to Canadian and Mexican citizens under what is now called the USMCA. And in Canada, they call it CUSMA, same thing. I think Mexico, they change it around too. Every country puts themselves first in this acronym, but it's all under the same free trade agreement to facilitate trade between Canada, Mexico, and the United States. And in trade, that encompasses people coming to work in the United States. And it is a non-immigrant temporary visa allowing people to live and work in the United States under the qualified occupations that they have determined that this status applies to. So who is eligible for a TN visa? Well, first, you must be a citizen of Canada. Canadian permanent residents do not qualify for TN status. You have to be a Canadian citizen. And you can be a Canadian citizen for all but one day. It doesn't matter how long you've been a Canadian, you just have to be a citizen. Once you're a Canadian citizen, then you potentially could qualify for TN status. And the basic qualifications, you have to have a job offer or a contract with a U.S. entity. And that job offer or contract must be to perform professional level services under one of those qualifying TN occupations. And I say contract or job offer because you can qualify a couple different ways. If you receive a job offer, let's say to come to the United States to work as a computer engineer for a U.S. entity, well, that's the straightforward process. They would give you the proper documentation to support you under that job offer to come and work and perform services for them in the United States. Another common one we see is Canadian companies who have contracts with U.S. clients and have to send their employees to the United States to service those contracts. We're working with an engineering company right now who has contracts to perform engineering services in the U.S., and they just got approval for 4 of their employees to come to the United States working for the Canadian company to service those contracts. The other one is if that we commonly see is if you are a consultant, for example, in Canada, and as a consultant, you have clients in the US that you need to service under an occupation that qualifies for consulting services in the United States, you can potentially qualify that way. You must also meet the education and experience requirements for that occupation. So under the USMCA, it has a list of all of the occupations, and next to each occupation, it also lists the minimum education and or experience requirements for that occupation. And it's a very tight box. If you don't fit into the box that they specify for that occupation, then you might not qualify. It doesn't matter how experienced you are in your occupation, which is unfortunate because of these requirements are very stringent. They're old, and if you don't fit it, then you may not qualify for the visa. So pay attention to the education and experience requirements for licensure requirements as well, to determine whether or not you would qualify for the TN. And you must be entering United States to engage in prearranged professional level employment. So they have to be able to demonstrate, the employer has to demonstrate that they have a need for your services, or if you are coming for a foreign employer, the foreign employer has to demonstrate that they have a contract for those types of services in the United States. And the reason that's important is you can't apply based on a potential need. This isn't a visa you can get in advance of wanting to work in the United States. The US doesn't have a blanket work permit where you can just say, hey, I want to go find a job in the US. I'm an engineer, so give me a work visa. No, you can't get the visa until you have the contract or the offer of employment. So that's why that's important. Approved TN occupations or professions. There's over 60 of them. Common ones that we see are accountants, engineers, computer systems analysts, computer engineers, management consultants, and we can go on. We've done TNs for all sorts of occupations that are under the list. But again, to reiterate, it's important that your occupation is on the list. We get a lot of calls for people in the trades, for example, that are working in construction, electricians, boilermakers. I just talked to a boilermaker the other day. Those occupations, the trades, are not occupations that qualify for TN status. So you cannot get a TN to come and work in the United States if you're a boilermaker, for example, because it is not under the TN occupations list. So no matter what your occupation or your expertise is, if it's not on the list, it's not on the list, and there's nothing we can really do about it. And each of those specific categories has differing licensure or degree or experience requirements. They're not all the same. One thing they do share in common is when you're looking at the education and experience requirements, a bachelor's degree, when they say it's a bachelor's degree, well, it must be a 4-year degree or higher, and it has to be especially related to the occupation. So if you're coming to work as an engineer, for example, well, you need to have an engineering degree. You can't have a general business degree and then qualify as an engineer, no matter how many years of experience you worked as an engineer. You need to have an engineering degree or an engineering license. And some of the occupations have an and or requirement where you can have an alternate. So you could qualify again as an engineer, having a bachelor's degree in engineering or higher, or by being a professional engineer, for example, you could also qualify. There are also ones that have diploma and licensure qualifications that you can meet as well. And it can get tricky. You got to remember when you're applying for TN status that it applies to North America. And that usually we run into issues with individuals trying to apply for a TN because they were educated outside of North America. So if you were educated outside of North America, then you need to really pay close attention to your degrees. For example, when it's talking about a diploma or a certificate, a diploma, by definition, under the USMCA, is a 2-year degree earned in either Canada or the United States. That's it. So if you have a diploma and it's outside of the US or Canada, it doesn't matter if it's a 3-year diploma, it doesn't qualify. It has to be earned in Canada or the United States. And a certificate is a 2-year degree earned in Mexico. So if you have a lot of occupations have certificates, what does it matter if it's not a 2-year certificate from Mexico or a 2-year diploma from Canada or the United States? Then those certificates and diplomas aren't going to qualify you for TN status. We see that a lot with countries that have a 3-year degree, for example. Maybe the individual did not earn a 4-year degree. Well, that could be problematic for the TN visa process. Also, you need to make sure you get equivalency. So if your degree was earned outside of North America and it is a 4-year degree, well, you need to get an equivalency that proves that your degree is a 4-year degree, equivalent to a US 4-year degree. So very important to ensure that your credentials match those requirements exactly. And those requirements can be tricky depending on where you've earned your education. And I'll turn time over to Christine to take it away from here to talk about the application process.
Yeah, so there's two ways that you can really apply for a TN as a Canadian. And the first way is to apply directly at a port of entry. So you can appear at a port of entry, sometimes without an interview. That would include your pre-clearance airports. Bring your TN documentation with you, make an application, and get a decision the same day that you're presenting yourself, which is a great benefit to Canadians to be able to get decisions in the short term like that. Pre-clearance airports are a great option. You've got to keep in mind, though, if you are applying at one of those pre-clearance airports, you do need to have a ticket to fly that day, or they're not going to admit you through immigration. So you do need to purchase a ticket. And we get that question a lot of people, hey, can I just go to the airport? Sure, but you got to have a ticket. Every port, you got to keep in mind, has nuances in their processes and procedures. So it's important to check with your attorney before you go to ensure that you're complying with those specific procedures. For example, some of our Buffalo ports here do require you to make an appointment in advance of your interview, and you can't just show up and ask to be seen and ask to be adjudicated without an appointment. Or if you do, they'll just kind of like put you off to the side and make you sit there for hours, well, to see if anybody doesn't show up. And you may get turned away that day without even getting seen. So there are nuances. Keep those in mind. If you're choosing a port, check on that before you go. The benefits to applying at a port of entry include same day decision, which I just talked about. And if you're applying at a pre-clearance airport or a port, between Canada and the United States, if something goes wrong with your application, you're going to get turned back to Canada. Okay, you're going to withdraw your application, and you're going to be allowed to re-enter Canada in most cases. And so that's a great benefit too. In some instances, you may be able to return, collect documentation, and reapply the same day. So keep that in mind as a benefit as well. You can also apply for TN or TD status really for dependent family members. Unfortunately, dependent family members cannot work in TD status. So your spouse, children under the age of 21, and when I say spouse, we're talking about a spouse with a marriage certificate. So common law partners in Canada, I know they have all the benefits of being married, but you will not be able to apply for a TD without proving that you have a marriage certificate. If your family members are not Canadian citizens, they're not going to have the benefit that Canadians do of applying for that dependent status right at the border. So keep that in mind and bring that to the attention of your attorney, your TN attorney, because there's another process that family member will need to use to apply for their TD status. They'll have to apply through a consulate, which can take more time and is a completely different process than just showing up at the border. Like I said, those dependents cannot work in the United States, but they can study. So if there's a course they want to take or they want to enroll in school, children obviously can enroll in school. Spouses can take courses as well. But keep in mind, these family members do not, as a part of the TD process, get access to a social security number. So that's something to keep in mind as well when you're planning for this process. So that's only a security numbers or social security number is really something that's only available to people that have work authorization. And keep also in mind that as a single intent status, you can't plan to live permanently in the United States when you have a TN visa. So those family and the TN applicant may need to prove ties to Canada or to their home country and their intent to return there at the end of their status. That kind of proof can look like multiple different documents. So you can, maybe you own property there, maybe you have, ties in other ways to the country. But just keep in mind, you can be asked to provide that if the officer who's adjudicating your case thinks that you might be planning to live permanently in the US. And I see we have questions about that, so we'll address those specifically about that point. We can address those at the end of the conversation. When you apply for a TN at the border, so that was the first option we talked about, applying at the border, at the port of entry on the day of, that you're coming in. You got to keep in mind, there's only certain times you can do that. So you can't apply for your TN a year before you're about to start. You can only do that 10 days before the start date listed in your support letter. So plan accordingly. Some ports of entry do require you to make an appointment, like I said. And sometimes they're booking out a couple weeks. So you want to make sure that you plan for that. What do you need to bring with you when you go to the border? Well, certainly you want to bring proof of your Canadian citizenship, because without that, they're not going to be able to adjudicate you. Have your passport with you. Your passport, like Jeremy said, it can be 1 day old and you can prove that you're a Canadian citizen, you're going to be able to be adjudicated. You're also going to need to have with you the most important piece of documentation in a TN, which is your TN support letter or job offer. And that is really the key document that's going to provide the information to the officer about what you're going to be doing, who you're going to be doing it for, how long you plan to be doing it for, and what you're getting paid to do it. So it's going to outline all that key information for the officer. Our tip typically with TN support letters is make sure that it's easy to read and all the information is laid out in very simple terms for the officer so that they don't have to do a lot of work and digging to find the key information. Proof of qualifications, you're going to want to have a copy of your degree with you. And I would encourage everybody, because it is required, to have the original degree with them as well. So a copy in your application package along with that degree. If it's in a frame and you can't take it out of the frame, I have seen plenty of people at the border with huge frames with their diploma inside it. You do need to bring the original, so pack that with you when you travel. You won't need it in the future, just on that first adjudication. And then also your transcript. So your transcript is really going to show what you studied. And so if your degree is not really exactly related, so for example, Jeremy talked about applying for an engineer as, you need an engineering degree. If you have a related degree, so for example, if you're applying as a software engineer and perhaps you have an engineering degree that isn't software engineering, but you think you still qualify, that transcript is going to be key to show that border officer, that adjudicating officer, that you've taken the coursework to qualify for that TN profession. So like I said, the benefit of applying at the border is you're going to be reviewed right there on the spot. So that entails an interview face-to-face with an officer. They're going to ask you questions and you're going to answer the questions. They're going to ask about what your qualifications are. They can ask you about what the job is, what you're going to be doing. So be prepared and understand your role and have that information with you. We also said there's going to be a decision right there on the spot. That means if you're approved, you can enter and you can start work on your start date. And if your start date's the next day, you can start work the next day. So it's a great benefit to be able to do that with that short-term adjudication. The validity period on a TN, the maximum amount of time you can ask for is 3 years. So that means when you're applying with a support letter, you need to outline that validity period of the TN that you're asking for. Now it's a maximum of 3 years. So there's no minimum amount of time you can apply for. If you're coming to work for 1 day in the United States and you're required to have a TN for it, you can apply for a TN for 1 day. So it's any time between those 2 periods. Like I said, the benefit of applying at the border is it's best for quick turnaround if you want a decision very quickly. There's no filing fee at the border, so there's no I-129 filing fee associated with this. Another great benefit that can get expensive. And just keep in mind, a record is made of your attempts when you apply at the border. So even though the officer may treat it very casually and say, hey, you know what, your documentation isn't sufficient, there's a record of that. So you want to make sure you put your best foot forward on the first attempt and have all your documentation and all your ducks in a row on that first try. We do hear stories of people calling us that said, hey, I tried to apply for a TN just to see if I could get it. That's not a good idea. There's a record now made of that person's attempt. And you always want to make sure that if you're applying for some kind of immigration benefit in the United States, check those qualifications and check you have everything you need before you try to do that. The other way you can apply for a TN, and plenty of people choose this option for various different reasons, is applying directly with USCIS. So the first option of applying at the border, you're actually applying with Customs and Border Protection. That's a different part of Homeland Security than USCIS. So you can ask USCIS to adjudicate your application by sending it in through the mail. And that application that goes in through the mail looks a little different than one that's applied for at the border. There are some forms that go along with that, some questions on those forms that need to be responded to. But generally speaking, the same information is provided, and the same information is key. So that TN support letter will also be included in that application and is going to have to include all the same information that you need at the border. So the process of filing is, like I said, through the mail with a form I-129 and the associated filing fees for that form. There are processing times for this. You're not going to get a same-day decision with USCIS. So check the processing times before you file. I think right now it's around 5 months, which is rather lengthy if you're trying to start a new job. So it may not make sense if you're trying to start a new position to even go through USCIS. There is the option to apply for premium processing. That comes at a very steep additional filing fee, but if your employer is willing or you're willing to pay that, then you can get a decision in 15 business days. The hard part is sometimes it doesn't exactly look like 15 business days because USCIS can issue what's called a request for evidence and ask for more information, which then they give you a few months to respond to. So that can really extend the processing time if you need to respond to one of those, gather more information, get it back to USCIS. That 15-day processing time starts all over again, 15 business days all over again once you submit that response. So we may be looking at, even if you're fast at responding, 30 to 40 business days at the end of the time. And so it may make sense to apply at the border if you want something faster. One of the benefits of applying for a TN with USCIS is for people who are already working on a TN in the United States, and perhaps their TN is coming to an end, their validity period, and they just want to extend the status with their current employer. Filing with USCIS will mean, number one, they don't need to travel. They can keep working for their employer while the application is pending. Excuse me. And that way they won't have to go through a border interview. They can keep working, and the application will be adjudicated. And then once it's approved, they won't have to travel to verify that information with the border. Then just on their next entry, they'll present that approval notice. So it is great for people that don't want the inconvenience of travel and want to be able to keep extending their status in the United States and keep working through the adjudication. It is not good if you have to travel, though. So if you choose to file with USCIS as an extension in that manner, and you do end up leaving the country, your application could be denied. So it's very important to pick the correct pathway when you're applying with USCIS to make sure you don't somehow, put a nail in your coffin on your TN application just by taking a trip outside the US. It's also not good if you need fast approval. It can become expensive if you're filing with premium processing, and you need that faster adjudication. So it's definitely not, the almost free way of doing it at the border. But there's that benefit of no interview. So if you do not like talking to a CBP officer, this may be the best way for you to apply. Oh, pre-clearance at the airport versus land border. All right, so pre-clearance versus land border. The pre-clearance, you're going to have more rights under Canadian law because pre-clearance is actually on Canadian soil. When you withdraw your application to enter the United States, you're certainly going to have that option available to you. They're just going to release you back into Canada. You may have all heard that horror story of that young woman from Vancouver who was detained in the United States, who was applying from Mexico for a TN. There was all sorts of other information that went along with her situation that created a situation where she couldn't be released back into Canada because she was applying in Mexico. So if you really want to ensure that you're not going to encounter anything like that, pre-clearance is a great way to go. Even at the land border, if you're applying from a Canadian land border situation, in most cases, they're going to allow you to withdraw your application and turn you back into Canada. Situations really only arise if you're trying to apply it. And some of our clients find it more convenient to apply with the Mexican border, but you are putting yourself at risk in that situation. Mexican, border officers aren't used to conducting Canadian TN interviews. So you're probably not going to get the best adjudication. And then there is always that risk that if there's something wrong with your case or your situation, or maybe there's some, information about you that the government thinks they have that isn't even true, they can take you and detain you because they can't return you to Mexico without permission from Mexico to do that. So, choose based on your comfort level and your preparedness. We typically advise a Canadian land port or pre-clearance airport as the best place to make your TN application.
All right. So we have got quite a few questions. And before we go into the common mistakes, I would like to address the questions. Questions are always better than what we think you want to know. You're telling us exactly what you need. So the first one is a question that we've received a lot lately with the current administration and with the story that Christine just mentioned, the horror story for the Canadian who's detained in the Mexican border. And the question is, are there any additional challenges with the current political climate between the US and Canada? I'm going to give you my straightforward answer. For us, in the last 100 days of Trump presidency, we haven't seen anything different with our clients. It's been the same process. The rules are the same. There is the one, and when people ask me this on a consultation or a phone call, I ask them, how many of these have you seen? These Canadian TNs detained at the border. One. That's the one horror story. There's one. That's it. But because of the political climate, they've decided to publicize it and make that person a postal child for immigration purposes. The rules are the same. Now, is there a little bit more scrutiny? Yes. I had a client today who actually emailed after he applied for his L1 visa, which was at a port of entry. You can do those at a port of entry too, but similar to a TN as far as the process goes. And he said that this time around was they asked a lot more questions than they did the first time he went. Well, it's the same procedure. He had the right documents. He's still qualified. Sure, they might ask a few more questions. They may dig in a little bit more into what you're doing just to verify that you qualify. And that's all that they're doing. They're verifying that you qualify to enter the United States for the purpose that you want to enter. And if that all checks out, you shouldn't expect anything different than you have in the past, okay? And we have not. We have had zero clients, and we have a lot of clients. We have clients going daily to the border. We've had zero experience anything beyond what we would normally expect them to experience during the application process. As long as you are qualified and have the proper documentation, that you don't have a criminal history and immigration violations or anything in your past, there's really no need to fear if you have the right preparation and documentation.
And the other thing we should note is you're not trying to commit fraud. So you're not applying for a TN you don't qualify for, or you're not doing the job that your TN says that you're doing. So misrepresentation and fraud is another thing that people should steer away from. If your job's not on the TN list, it's not on the list for a reason. It doesn't qualify. And a TN may not be the right option for you. There may be a better visa option for you.
Yeah, not being on the list doesn't make you a management consultant. Okay. And that's what people say. Oh, I'm not on the list. So can we just call myself? Can we just call me a management consultant? No, you can't unless you're a management consultant. And that horror story that you see in the news, guess what she did? She said she was a management consultant when she was not. And she got caught in that lie. So don't do that. Do Do Canadian citizens who do not reside in Canada qualify? If one does not live in Canada, how can they prove ties to Canada? Is it enough to provide ties to the country of residence? The answer is you do not need to reside in Canada. And yes, you can provide ties to wherever you live. So the rule for a TN is that it's non-immigrant and you maintain ties to your foreign residence. So it doesn't have to be Canada. It could be whatever other country you might be living in that's not the United States that you have ties, residence to in that country. And intent is something that typically does not come up in a TN application. Even though it's a non-immigrant visa, it doesn't come up typically unless you bring it up. You say or do something during your border interview that causes concern for the officer that makes them believe that you're going to be staying here longer than your visa. So those problems typically arise because people are saying things they shouldn't be saying at the border or doing something they shouldn't be doing. Like, hey, I'm getting my we've seen these things where someone will say, hey, I'm married to a US citizen. I'm just going to go in and get my green card tomorrow. The border officer is going to turn you around because you just said you want to live in the US and you don't have status to do that. So if you're on a TN coming to work and you say, yeah, I'm coming on a TN, but I want to get my green card tomorrow too. Yeah, well, you just declared immigrant intent and that can turn you around. So typically it doesn't come up unless you bring it up. If they ask you what your intent is, the answer that I always tell people to give is, well, right now, my intention is for this temporary position. At the end of that job, I'll make up my mind on what I want to do. But right now, I'm just here for this job. And that's typically sufficient. Christine, you have anything to add there?
No, we help a lot of TN people who have US citizen spouses, girlfriends, boyfriends they're living with. And generally speaking, the officer doesn't care who your family is and whether they're a US citizen, and they're not going to ask you that question. Of course, if they do, then you're honest with them. You know, if they ask you where you're going to be living, you can tell them. If they ask you who you're going to be living with, be honest. But in 99.9% of cases, that does not come up. They don't care where you're living, who you're living with here in the United States, because the fact of the matter is you're showing up at the border asking them to come in and do work for a US employer. And that's the key here, right? The US employer is saying, hey, we need this person to come work. They gave you paperwork and you're at the border asking to come in for that job. That is the key focus on the employment.
How do you communicate your TN eligibility to potential employers who might not understand the difference between a TN and H-1B? So
That's a good question.
if I understand that question correctly, well, there's a big difference between H-1B and TN, and most employers treat you as an H-1B, potential H-1B employee, and that process requires a petition. You can't just show up at the border and get an H-1B. You have to get approval with USCIS first. Whereas a Canadian applying for a TN, you have the option of doing it by mail or at the border. And the application process is much more seamless and does not require that formal sponsorship or petition process that an H-1B would. And if you're trying to explain it to an employer, that's the big difference. They don't have to file a petition with USCIS. They don't have to file paperwork with the US Department of Labor. All they need to really provide you with is a support letter or job offer. They call it a job offer. We call it a support letter because most job offers are not written properly. But a support letter that you would take and you make that application on your own. So the employer's only involvement in this process is that offer letter. Everything else is done by you, the applicant, at the border with your degree and your qualifications. That's their limited involvement, and it does not require that formal sponsorship with Department of Labor or USCIS. You can just do it at the border.
That being said, a lot of job applicant processes ask if you need sponsorship. And truthfully speaking, you do. So you should really choose yes. But we understand that sometimes that kicks you right out of the applicant process. So sometimes we've talked to people and what they've done is said no to the sponsorship, but then at the earliest possible moment, let the HR department know that they will need support for a TN. So that's how people get around it. As lawyers, I generally don't like telling people to say no to that question because it's kind of untruthful, but you know, it does sometimes kick you right out of the process if you do say yes.
Yeah, and if you bring it up as early as possible in that interview process, then you're gonna get a feel for whether or not they're willing to help you with the limited support you'd need for a TN. If you say you need an H-1B at that point, they're probably gonna just kick you right out of the process. But TN, once they understand, a lot of them are fine with doing it.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, if they're not comfortable with the TN and they, you know, decline to approve, you know, move forward with you, that wasn't a good TN employer anyway. So there was no
Yeah,
way to
what's the
do it.
likelihood of them doing a green card or anything else in the future if they don't even want to do a
Exactly,
TN, right?
exactly. So that's not a good employer. So I would say that, you know, if that's the kind of feedback you're getting, move on and find someone who is willing to move forward with that process.
Yeah, that's a good point. So for Canadians educated in Quebec, Quebecois, I don't know, I don't speak French, and everything's in French, what kind of translation would we provide? Well, it has to be English. So whatever, it doesn't matter if it's French, it doesn't matter if it's Italian, you know, Portuguese, whatever language it is, if it's not English and the document you're presenting is not in English, well, the requirement that is that you have to have a English translation of that document along with it. So it doesn't matter. Make sure you have an English translation if a document's not in English. Where can you get the list of pre-clearance airports and ports of entry? So I think that was dropped in the chat already. So you can find that in the link to that in the chat. And if you do have questions about a specific port that's not on the list only contains ports and pre-clearance places that are what they call optimized ports of entry for TN processing. Others do it. So smaller ones will adjudicate TN still. It just means that they don't have dedicated USMC or NAFTA officers to do it. So you can run into issues sometimes when you're going to one of those smaller ports. So if you want to go to a port that's close to you that's not on the list, then our suggestion would be call that port, see if they do TNs, and then they will let you know if they do, if you need an appointment or what their procedure is. I'll let you answer this one, Christine, because I think this was in response to when you were
Okay.
discussing application. It says, if your TN application gets rejected at Pearson, can you still board the flight and enter the US as a visitor?
That is going to be entirely up to the officer who you're being adjudicated by. So generally speaking, you can ask them if they can admit you as a visitor, but you need to have a visitor reason to come into the United States. So if they think that you're coming in just to go to work, they're probably not going to allow you to be admitted as a visitor. If you can say, hey, I was tying this trip in with a visit to my friend in New York City, and I'm flying to New York and I'm just going to stay for the weekend and visit with them, then they may admit you as a visitor. But you need to then at that point explain that you have the intention to be a visitor and not the intention to start working in the US. So if you make that clear, a lot of times officers understand. Certainly that question comes up if people are applying for an extension of a TN at the airport. For example, they've been working for 3 years on a TN, and they either want to change employers or they want to extend their application or their status, and they apply again at the airport and they get turned down for maybe the job change, maybe this new employer, their position doesn't qualify. A lot of times our people that I talk to, I'll say, hey, just ask the officer if you can come in and tie up those loose ends, right? So you've had an apartment in the US, you have your stuff there and you got to get it out. A lot of times they'll let you in as a visitor in that situation and come and tie up those loose ends. And then, you know, then you're in.
Yeah, very much at the discretion of that officer as to
Sure.
whether or not. You got to remember, you just declared your intent to come in the United States to work, right? And now you got to make them believe, oh, no, I'm not going to work. I'm going to go visit. So that's part of the complication. Can you give us examples of ties? And I'll let you do this one too, Christine. This was in response to what you were talking about. Can you give us
Sure.
examples of ties to to Canada or your home country, except from property. It might be hard for young applicants to have property.
Right, and so we see this come up in TN applications extremely rarely, almost never. The officer's not asking for this evidence unless there's some kind of situation that maybe you haven't been living outside the United States for a long period of time. If you've been in the US for a long period of time, you've been renewing a TN for multiple 3-year periods, then at that point, usually it'll come up. Hey, you've been in the United States for 15 years. Can you prove to us that you plan to return to Canada or your home country at the end of this TN period, in order for us to approve you? Usually if it's a young applicant, they understand if you don't own property. Perhaps you have a bank account, an RRSP in Canada. It could be really anything. You have family there. You have a letter from your parents saying, hey, when John finishes his TN, he's going to come back and live with us in Canada. It could be something as simple as that. But generally speaking, we don't arm our clients with concrete evidence before they go to the border for their first TN in this situation, because it rarely comes up. But you should be able to explain it if the officer asks you, how can I be sure you're going to go back to Canada at the end of this TN? Be able to explain to them. So there's not really much more I can add to that. It's such a specific situation, an individual situation. Work with your lawyer to come up with some evidence that's going to work in your situation.
Yeah, and depending on it, very situational, and they typically want at least 6 months of proof. If you're looking at how long, if you get to that point, and again, like Christine said, and I'll reiterate it, it typically doesn't happen. There has to be something that triggers that request for them to be asking for those ties. It's not a common ask in a TN application. There's a couple of questions, and if we don't answer your question, there's a couple in here that are probably more suited for a consultation. If we don't address it, and you do have that specific question that you want asked that's more specific and not general, that would be more suited for a consultation. Is there a direct path from a TN to permanent residency? So direct path, no, there isn't written into the regulations TN to green card, like for example, an L1. And that's a good question. Most visas don't have a direct path to a green card, by the way. Everyone thinks that there's an H-1B direct path to green card. No, there's not. Actually, the path from a TN to a green card is the exact same path as an H-1B to a green card. Typically, it's through the PERM process, and your employer would sponsor you through PERM to get a green card, either on a TN or an H-1B. Or if you are married to a U.S. citizen, it would be through adjustment of status or consular processing through marriage to a U.S. citizen. The same pathway from a TN to an H-1B, or from a TN to a green card or an H-1B to a green card. It's the same pathway. Neither of them have a direct path. But can you be on a TN and get a green card? And I think that's what the overriding question is. Yes, you can, as long as it's done correctly. You can go from a TN to a green card just as you could from an H-1B to a green card. I have a pending I-130 and got a job offer. Great question. We get this one all the time. And it's a really complicated question to answer for you to probably fully understand the answer. But the answer is yes, you can still do a TN even if you have a pending I-130. First of all, it's pending. It could get denied. There's nothing saying that it's going to be approved, right? So a pending I-130 really means nothing at that point. Also, an I-130 is a petition for someone else on your behalf. They are requesting you to be classified as a person who qualifies to potentially request a green card if that is approved. For example, maybe this is a sibling of a U.S. citizen, and they're petitioning you for a green card. You can still get a TN. Depends on where it is in the process. If it's pending, absolutely. You would just need to still demonstrate non-immigrant intent. And this is a case, that's a type of situation where it might be brought up, right? Oh, we see you have a pending I-130. Are you immigrating? Well, no, not at the moment. I'm not. I'm just coming to work temporarily. So when you get into those situations where you have a pending, approved I-130 or I-140, you can still get a TN as long as you do it correctly. It does add a little bit of complication to it. In those situations, I would not recommend trying to do it on your own, because if you mess it up, then you could derail your opportunity to get a TN. However, if you do it correctly, you can absolutely still get a TN.
Yeah, and this case in particular, they're saying that they have already a DS form being requested by the consulate. That's a security request form that they're asking for. So that means this person is already not only has an approved I-130, but they've also been for a consular interview, and perhaps their application, their immigrant visa application is being adjudicated. Once you submit an immigrant visa
Yeah,
application,
that's different. You've already started
you've
consular
expressed
process.
immigrant intent at that point, and now no TN is going to be approved for you. It'd be very difficult to get one approved at that point and say, I have filed for an immigrant visa, but I don't have immigrant intent. That no officer is going to buy that.
You would have to withdraw that application and show that you're not moving forward to have any chance. So yeah, so there's two stages in that process where you absolutely have declared immigrant intent and it's very difficult to move forward. If you're completing consular processing or you're working with NVC, and that's what this person is doing, right?
Mhm.
Or you have filed for adjustment of status in the United States. Both of those are declarations of immigrant intent and very difficult to overcome for a TA. Does the job offer need to specify a duration, Christine?
Yes, it does. According to our friendly CBP agents, they want to see a specific duration within that 3-year time period.
So have a start date and an end date. As short as 1 day, no more than 3 years. If already on a TN visa and planning to extend or apply for a new one at a consulate, okay, so that can't be, it can't be done as, this is for Canadians, so I'm not quite sure what your citizenship, if you're asking that question. You can't apply at a consulate for a TN if you're a Canadian citizen. There's no consular processing option. So if an attorney tells you to go to the consulate and you're Canadian, they don't know what they're talking about. Canadians do not apply for TNs at a consulate. They actually don't get a visa. And I know the whole slide says visa everywhere, but Canadians are visa exempt. They get TN status just based on their passport, and you get admitted into the United States in status under a TN to work. So you don't actually get a visa. So this is in regards to Canadians. That question would not apply at all to a Canadian. It's something you don't need to worry about because you would never apply for a TN at a consulate as a Canadian.
Yeah, that person may be referring to a Mexican TN, which is a whole different process.
Mexicans are not visa exempt and they require that visa at the consulate. I've recently been approved for EB2. I think they EBW. I think they mean NIW. And have been waiting for an interview date for Monterey for over 10 months. Okay, so I think this goes back to the previous question. If you're waiting for your interview, it depends on what you mean by that. If you've already paid your consular processing fees, you've already commenced the process with NVC, you've already submitted your documents with NVC, well, you've declared immigrant intent. And now you're just waiting for your interview at the consulate. You've told immigration that you're immigrating to the United States and you want a green card. So if you've already got to that step, well, good news is you're in the final stages. Bad news is you already declared immigrant intent, as we previously mentioned. Chance of getting a TN at that case is slim to none unless you withdraw that application altogether and demonstrate that you do not have that intent to immigrate. Have you had a better success rate of approval for applicants at the border or through the mail? And we can both speak to this. Christine, I'll let you go first.
I mean, I think we have more applications going through the border than through the mail. I think our success rate at the border, because of that, is just higher, just because we have a higher number going through the border. And then the other aspect is when you're making a border application, if it's denied or withdrawn, A lot of times you can correct for it and get the person back to the border in short order with the documentation or information that the border thought was lacking. When you're denied with USCIS, that's a little bit more, I'd say more rare, just because we have less applications going there. But, it's not a matter of just reapplying then with USCIS. In most cases, addressing that information is going to be more difficult. So I'd say our success rate's better with CBP than with USCIS. Typically, people aren't applying with USCIS unless there's a complication with CBP already. So it may be a complex TN case that they don't want going through the border. So it's already got a lower chance of success. And that's why we would advise perhaps applying with USCIS than with CBP, because it's a complex situation. But it's, I can't give numbers, but I'd say success rate, I definitely advise my clients, if there's no reason for them not to go to the border, to go to the border. I feel like the scrutiny may be a little lower, and in most cases, it's a better chance of approval.
Yeah, and I would agree. And we're talking about Canadians here, okay? So in regards to Canadians, for the vast majority of our clients, the border is the best option. You're going to get an immediate decision. You can have a discussion with the officer. If you have the proper documents, then the border is going to be your best option the majority of the time. It's very case specific, like Christine said. If you have complicating factors, or you've been denied or refused, then it may make sense to do the mail over the border. Or if you're extending or changing employers and you're already in the US, then mail might be your best option. I just filed 5 TNs this last week by mail. 4 of them were approved. 1 of them was denied. Exact same cases. Like, there's no reason the 5th one should have been denied. So
they were even for the
no
same
problem with
employer.
USCIS. Same employer. It's actually anyway, which is comical, because how are you approving the 4 and not the 5th? Exact same company, exact same job, no grounds for the denial of the 5th one. But the problem is you filed by mail, right? So now you have to go back to USCIS, and guess how you communicate? Snail mail. You're going back and forth with USCIS. Belabored process, much more expensive. When you run into complications, it's not easily overcome. Like Christine said, if you're at the border and you show up and maybe something's a little out of sorts, they'll tell you what it is. You go correct it, and then sometimes same day you can go back with the update, and then you're fine. You can't do that with USCIS. So I wouldn't necessarily say there's a higher approval rate with one or the other, because you see CBP make mistakes just like that too, where they deny people that shouldn't be denied as well. There's always human error in the process. I would say if you're approvable, you're approvable. You should feel comfortable with the right documentation by mail or USCIS. And it really comes down to your case and your occupation and your qualifications. Can you have a 1099 on a TN? Well, the regulations don't specify how you must be paid when you're working on a TN, just that you're compensated by a US entity. And actually, if you're working for a Canadian entity, you could be compensated by that Canadian entity to be on a TN. And it does not designate that it must be 1099 or W-2. What's important is that you have an employer-employee relationship and you're performing professional level services under a qualifying occupation in the US. So the answer is yes, you can be on a 1099 and have a TN. We have many clients that are on 1099s and on a TN, as long as you're not self-employed, which is different than just on a 1099 does not mean you're self-employed. And some people read into, oh, you're on a 1099, therefore you're self-employed. Not necessarily. You can be on a 1099 and still be considered an employee.
The definition for 1099 versus W-2 employee, which for Canadians, that's like a T4, W-2 is like a US T4. The definition of employment for immigration is slightly different from the definition of employment W-2 versus 1099 for tax purposes. So you're asking about a tax construct of a contract employee on 1099. in the immigration definition is different. So you can be an employee for immigration and be a contractor. It's
For
for
tax purposes.
taxes. Yeah, for
Correct.
taxes. So there are two different, scenarios there, two different definitions.
Yeah, very good point. Good explanation. It's a good way to put it. You're intersecting two different areas and trying to make sense of it, and it doesn't always jive. Um, if one gets an offer in U.S. consulting company, can one apply under the management consultant profession? Yes. And I need more details to answer that fully, but I'm just going to answer it on its face. Yeah, that's actually the boilerplate consulting arrangement that they like to qualify or approve for TNs. You are working for a KPMG, a Deloitte, a consulting company who's in the business of doing consulting in the United States. That's their business. They're consultants, and they're hiring you as a consultant to advise their clients. Absolutely. That's boilerplate management consultant. That's what they want to see when you're applying for a TN as a consultant. All right, so that comes to the end of those questions. So to wrap things up, I'll just quickly go over some of the mistakes that we see, and Christine, you can chime into with anything that you might have. But some of the most common mistakes we see is people apply under an internal job title. You'll get a job offer and it'll have some job title on there. I don't know, the amazing wizard of engineering processes for snails. I don't know, some crazy title that's not even an occupation. And I look at them, I'm like, I don't know, what is your occupation? What do you actually do? So remember, when you're applying for a TN, you're applying for a visa to work in the United States, and you're applying under an occupational category. You're not applying for a job. You're not applying. So job titles can be very deceiving to a border officer. You can have a job title and they look at that job title and it means nothing to them. So job title not matching a TN occupation or clearly identifying how your job title fits into an occupation that's on the list can be very problematic, especially if your job title off the bat signals something that is not even related to a TN occupation. They may just look at your job title and deny you without looking any further, and they don't want to see anything else because that job title is so far off of an occupation. So
Yeah.
applying
Companies
under the
call
occupation
people
is important.
companies call people all kinds of weird stuff. So I did a TN recently for a lawyer, and all the attorneys at that firm were called shareholder. That's not a job. So if they were
Yeah.
applying with their job title, they would definitely not have gotten a TN approved. So you have to be careful there.
Incomplete or inconsistent supporting documents. The supporting documents are pretty straightforward, but people oftentimes fail here. Christine mentioned this when she was talking about applying. You need to have your degree with you, whether it's in the frame or not. You need your degree. You need that original support letter or copy of that original support letter from your employer. You need your passport. You need these basic documents. If you're relying on experience, you need your experience letters. You need to have all of that supporting documents with you. So you need to make sure you have a complete application. You're not missing anything. And I think I see this mistake most often with somebody who had a TN in the past, and they think that, oh, I had one in the past, so I'm just going to go get one again. When you go apply again, you're being looked at as if you've never had a TN. They don't care if you had one in the past. Actually, officers take it a badge of honor if you've had one in the past and they get to deny you this time, or they get to take away the TN you have. So when you're applying, make sure you're applying every time just as if you've never ever had one. And you're going to face that level of scrutiny every time. If you do that, then you'll be properly prepared. Applying for a role that does not meet education requirements. So if you apply again for a role that that is not on the occupation list, then that's a very common reason for denial. And not understanding the temporary intent requirement. And we discussed this at length. Temporary intent just don't declare it, or don't declare immigrant intent. And if you have a situation, and we covered a few in the questions, where you think you might have declared an immigrant intent, then you definitely want to talk to an attorney before you try to proceed with that application. If intent issues can be a big factor with a TN, however, most of the time it's not one. So if you do have intent situations that are raised because you've been petitioned or taken action that might indicate you have intent in the US, then in those cases, you probably want to talk to an attorney. Well, thank you for tuning in today. We do have some upcoming webinars to make you aware of if you have interest. We also, so does your job and degree qualify for a TN? In that webinar, we will go into the details on how to analyze your job offer, your education, and against an occupation to determine, okay, does this position and do I qualify for a TN? So that's a very good one if you want to understand the intricacies of trying to self-assess for a TN visa. Tricky TNs is the next one after that, where we're going to talk about specific job categories or occupations under the TN that can be complicated, like a management consultant, computer systems analyst, and scientific technician technologists. And then the third one, and this was one that we have to educate attorneys on this one all the time. TN visa to green card, and how can you transition from transition to permanent residency? And we had that question today. It's a very good one. But that's really a question that you need a whole entire segment just to talk about as well. So those are some upcoming webinars if you have interest in that you can go ahead and register if you have interest in those as well. And our contact information. So if you have any questions about U.S. immigration, TN visas, in general, we handle all aspects of U.S. immigration, not just TNs. We do the green card process. We do family-based immigration. We help businesses expand into the United States and do business in the U.S. So any U.S. immigration related issues that you might have or questions, we'd be glad to help you out. So thank you for tuning in, and have a great day, and we'll look forward to meeting with you again next time.
Thank you.